All right, so why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Oh gosh. I am in Korea, I'm 62. In the US, I'm 60 because they reckon birth dates a little differently here. Two kids, been married for 40 years. Two daughters who were 37 and 35. Uh, I was raised as a Pentecostal. I did the speaking in tongues and all of that for a long time. Uh, was very devout. Um, and it was actually a Baptist minister who encouraged me. I think he was trying to get me away from Pentecostalism. A matter of fact, I know that he was. So he said to examine my faith, and I did. And one day realized that I didn't believe anymore.
Well, I guess you could say he was successful to some degree, right?
More successful than he'd intended.
Yeah,
Yeah,
not quite exactly what he wanted, I assume. Yeah.
not what he
So
wanted.
the
Yeah.
the Pentecostal, is it the United Pentecostal Church International or the UPC? Is that what you were referring to?
To be honest, I don't think it was a member of any. I don't think it was part of any governing body.
Mm,
It was a family run Pentecostal church. I think it still exists in Everett, Washington. It was called the Gospel Light Temple, I believe. And it was like his mother, the pastor's mother, had originally established the church, which is sort of unusual.
mm.
And then from mother to son to daughter, um, yeah, that's what I was raised. That's what I was brought up in.
Okay, that makes
With
sense.
it wasn't there was none of it wasn't as extreme as there was no snake handling or anything like that, but there was definitely a lot of being slain by the Lord, where the minister would touch you in the forehead and you would flail backwards.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm fortunate enough to kind of to some degree know what you're referring to because when I grew up in a pretty generic Christian home in the United States, and I had a friend from elementary, like third grade, all the way through up till high school, um, and he was Pentecostal, and my parents church hopped a lot, so we didn't have our own denominational tradition that we were committed to or devout to. So I went
mhm.
from non-denominational church to a Baptist or whatever. So as a kid, yeah, I just thought they were all kind of the same thing. And he was Pentecostal, and since we were friends, I would go to his church sometimes. And I knew there were differences, but I didn't really understand it enough. But I was exposed to it. So something I remembered is um, his sister could never wear pants. She always wore a skirt. She couldn't wear makeup, and during gym classes and stuff, he could never wear shorts because I guess all of that
Right.
is their interpretation of modesty, and just other things like that. So is that similar to how your church was, where they kind of like did the women always wear skirts and stuff, have
Um,
really long hair?
I don't remember ever seeing a woman in pants,
Yeah.
but see, I'm old enough that I mean, it's going to sound stupid, but up until the time that I was probably in the fifth or sixth grade, you couldn't wear pants to school if you were a girl
Hmm. Okay.
at all. Not until maybe I was in the sixth or seventh grade could you.
And this was public school.
I mean, and that was public
Hmm.
schools. Um, and that might have been regional, but I lived all over the United States, all over the Pacific Northwest, I guess. But uh, none of the schools that I attended up until the beginning of the end of elementary school, the beginning of because that would have been the first part of the 1970s. So my elementary school years were spent in the 1960s.
Right. Right.
Uh,
That's
so
interesting.
so I don't know actually whether the church that I attended was, I don't think they were extreme. I think they were, I mean, there was definitely no consumption of alcohol, and they did exorcisms fairly routinely in the church. Uh, and services were interrupted. They were supposed to be interrupted by people jumping up and suddenly prophesying. Um, and there was regular faith healing meetings. I preached 2 or 3 days a week, standing on a street corner in Everett, Washington, plugged into a public address system.
I'm trying to
And if you
find some
ever
of those
familiar
guys.
with the Jack Chick tracks, those really horrible, sinister evangelical, I mean, and you know what I meant if you saw them, um, that were everywhere in the 60s and 70s. I distributed hundreds of those.
I don't. I'm actually looking for some street preachers where I'm at. Before I moved about 2 hours south down to the across the Arkansas border, there was a couple in my town, and I tried to catch them a few times with my camera so we could talk. My plan is to go to the Pride event, which is in June. It's Pride Month, and usually there's some street preachers, religious protesters there, and I want to go and interact with them and see if I can come up with something that might be worth recording. I've been trying to do that for a while because I think there's some potentially good. Because I'm not that kind of Christian to do something like that, so I'm trying to
Sure.
help the image a little bit, whatever little bit I can help. Um, but I don't know. I was about to say something which may or may not be true. I was going to say I don't think the Pentecostal background you have may be relevant to what we're going to talk about. Maybe it might. I don't know. So we'll table that for now. But this did come about from you being in it was at a Christian apologetics Facebook group. It's like a private group,
Right.
and it seems to be mostly Reformed Christians from the banner. It has all the solas. I don't know how many Catholics are actually in the group, but uh, would you say that your Pentecostal background may have had an influence on your deconversion, if you want to call it that? Because
Um, in a way, I suppose that it did. Um, Maybe I wouldn't have looked at anything in a skeptical way if I hadn't been confronted in my early years with some things that were fairly alarming. If you've ever been to a Pentecostal service,
yeah,
um, I spent, I mean, I'm no exaggeration here. I spent hundreds of hours at faith healing meetings, and when I was in middle school, there was I went to faith healing meetings at the gentleman I think out of Oregon named Vic Coburn. And I sort of realized one day that if you went up to be healed and you had a sore throat or something that you didn't actually need to be a doctor to diagnose, you were instantly healed. And but if you went up with a malady that anybody could perceive, then the same minister would say that slowly, with faith, over time, over a period of weeks. In other words, if you went up missing a leg or with the big, huge goiter on the side of your face or something like that, you left with that. So I sat for a couple of weeks with pen and paper and got the names of people who came off the stage, and they all died. you know, every single one of them, died. Eventually of what they'd gone up for. I went and visited them in convalescent homes and hospitals, uh, and that contributed. That contributed.
yeah, I can definitely
Uh,
see that. It's definitely a much more personal, experienced version of. I don't know. It's probably got some more formal names and different things that's called, but I refer to it as the "Why doesn't God heal amputees?" objection. Um,
exactly, exactly. There's even a web page I think with
hmm
that name.
Yeah, that was a really popular like talking point back in like the early 2010s, and um, it has some more formal names. It's just like a version of the problem of suffering or the Epicurean paradox. But okay, that makes sense.
But,
So that kind of sent you on your journey, and then from there it just kind of escalated. Or
effectively, um, I I live inside my head, always have done. So it's not that I'm not an emotional person. I am, right? I'll cry watching Bambi still, right?
well, yeah.
But um I don't use my emotions in making decisions. Uh that's what logic is for. Uh
You won't get
so as
any
much as
objection from me.
possible, as much as possible, I mean, yes, I've made all the mistakes that anyone has uh in relationships because, when you've fallen in love with somebody or think you have, sometimes being logical about it is difficult.
Hmm.
But I try to make my decisions based on the best available evidence and logic.
Well, you've come to the right place, and what I mean by that, necessarily, not that I'm going to persuade you or try to convert you. Just that's me. Have you had a chance to watch any of my content? I don't know if you found it or if I sent the link.
I didn't watch much. I watched. I mean, I had intended to. It's just been busy for me with teaching.
Right. Well,
I, you know,
I didn't really have an
uh,
expectation that you would or even should. Just the
I watched the one that I remember. He was from Ark,
yeah, that guy. I remember. I think his name was Kevin.
sort of bearded.
Yeah, yeah. Did
Um,
he have a beard? I don't actually remember. But
well, he
okay,
was. Yeah,
interesting first impression. Although like he was a Christian, we were talking about like young Earth stuff, but um, the bulk of my work that I've for whatever small audience I have at the moment is I do focus on like the rational side of it. Because I
hmm
think that audience is growing, even though I think the majority are fairly apathetic. The rational problems people have with it is that audience is growing, especially with the increased use of the internet and just overall quality of life increasing for most people where they have access to internet. They'll have more time to think about philosophical things and stuff. So um, I also went through a similar journey. I went through a sort of deconversion, reconversion kind of story, but it's not really worth telling here. But uh, I think the rational side is relevant, although I admit, and I'm not using it in a sort of I think it's good or bad way, but I think it's true that the majority of believers don't use a rational approach. So it's not for them. And I think, uh, I don't know, I don't have like a statistic for this, but I think a lot of non-believers also don't really necessarily care about the rational side of it either. I think most of them just
a
don't
lot
care.
of them don't.
They're
No,
just
no,
apathetic, right? So it's not that they're being irrational. They're not being rational or irrational. They just don't care. They're just not religious,
right.
secular people. They don't care. And honestly, so my content doesn't necessarily aim at either of them, of those two demographics. It's mostly about the Christian and the non-Christian, or even theism, that care about the rational side, whether it's because they're looking for arguments against theism, for theism. I try to actually address both of those. Um, so even though I am Christian theist myself, that doesn't mean my content can be completely useless to an atheist, because maybe I can help them strengthen their own atheist argument. Be like, okay, this one's not good, so you should use this one. Maybe something like that.
Sure.
I only have one video where I go over that, where I'm like, here's an argument you shouldn't use. So there's better ones out there. Don't use this one. I've had one of those, but I do actually plan on saying, here's where I. No, I had one other moment I think where I said this. I agree is a good objection, for example. Um, but for you and me, so what made you want to enter the group as a non-Christian? Was it just still wanting to maintain engagement, maybe find something you haven't heard before?
Well, one of my best friends is a Christian apologist. His name is Peter Kupitz, and I met him here in Korea, actually on Facebook. He arrived in Russia, as in the country. No, I'm sorry, Georgia, as in
Mm-hmm.
the country, a few days ago. Um, and He was one of the first Christians that I'd met who didn't automatically, because so many Christian apologists are evangelists. A
I mean,
very large
it
percentage,
makes
at
sense. Yeah.
least of the ones that are well known, are evangelists. So I read Stephen Meyer and Gary Habermas and Michael Licona and William Lane Craig and Ken Ham and Lee Strobel, and I read everything that comes out. I'm reading right now, in fact, Stephen Meyer's most recent, um, and the name escapes me.
The most recent work he did.
Yeah,
I know his
the
most
most recent
popular
one.
one. I'm not sure about the most recent one.
Well, he has one that's come out like within the last couple of months,
Yeah, I heard about it, but I'm not sure
and
what the name is.
I'm forgetting the. I think it's called Return to God or something. But basically, in all of his previous books, he didn't connect any of his apologetic or any of his arguments, I guess I should say, to Christianity. And this one he did. He didn't, matter of fact, he didn't explicitly connect it to anything except for theism. He was arguing that, and to be honest, I sort of agree with him. To me, theism is not an irrational idea, um, and it never has been. I'm going to confess that I find a lot of the claims of Islam and of Judeo Christianity to be irrational, or at least to sound more like narrative than I do things that are likely true. But theism in itself, as in the existence of an omnipotent, uh, omniscient, omnibenevolent super being who created the universe, that's as good an explanation as any other. I'm not a fan of really any of the cosmological. The past is the past, and it's permanently inaccessible to us. From a historiographic perspective. Um, so I don't find the idea that there is a creator of the universe any less or more rational than something that Larry Krauss would suggest.
Oh,
I
Lawrence
don't have any
Krauss.
basis. Sorry, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. I
Lawrence
was like,
Krauss.
are we? I was wondering who you're talking about. I think I know who you're talking about.
Um, so I mean, basically, it's a permanently unanswerable question. Unless we happen to build a time machine or something, and one answer isn't better than the other. They're just different answers.
Yeah. I mean, you won't get a whole lot of pushback from me on that. I mean, you touched a couple different things, and um, I think I maybe mentioned it, but I'm going to reiterate. I'm actually not trying to persuade or convert you by talking to you. I have
Mhm.
that's not even really a. I don't do that with anybody. I'll talk with people, debate with people, which is exchange ideas that were maybe present arguments or disagreements. But I'm not doing it for the explicit purpose of trying to persuade them because I usually don't think I can. It's not like what am I going to say that's so powerful. But a lot of the time, and I don't think this is the case with you, but I think a lot of people who put themselves, especially if they're atheists or some kind of non-believer, put themselves in positions where they're talking to an apologist or some kind of debate. They're probably not going to, even if they did change their mind, admit it. And a lot of them, I think, are just incredulous on their own. And I think that's also true with many, if not most, theists and religious people. So a lot of people aren't actually in the business of being sincerely open and changing their mind. While I think it does happen, But that doesn't mean the talk is completely useless, because there can be large audiences who just maybe heard something they've never heard before on either side, and that's where I think it can be valuable. Um,
I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm going to be upfront. I don't argue to win. It's not important to me whether I win. I think I've said this maybe on Facebook. I argue to learn. That's it. Um, if you go into Wikipedia and you type in dialectic and look up the definition that they provide of dialectic, it's basically argument or discourse, the exchanging of ideas as a method of self education. I don't remember exactly how they phrase it.
mhm.
That's why I argue, and I honestly don't care whether I'm right or wrong, because that's not why I argue. I argue to educate myself. It's, what better way? It's certainly more interesting than reading a book. uh, what better way to learn about a diverse range of subjects than to talk to people about it?
Yeah, that's exactly true, and not trying to win is good because it's not a competition. I'm not even sure who would
No,
decide who the winner is. It's not. There's no prize. And something that you did in the group as an atheist, the post, was giving advice to apologists and Christians that are engaging in these sort of dialogues of what would be helpful from the atheist perspective, or from a non-believer perspective. So I can start with that, and you might find some refreshing things from me, because I'm pretty sure I'm atypical in a lot of Christian areas. And I think with most people, I don't want to say most, for with a lot of people, because we're just people at the end of the day, um,
mm-hmm.
we're all unique in our ways, and so there's going to be a degree of that uniqueness reflected in their system of beliefs. But I'll also be the first to admit, as with religious people and Christians not excluded, maybe even this might even be more true with Christians, is they can be prone to ideological possession, just adopting an entire system of beliefs and being very homogenous, especially if they're strong in a tradition, like maybe UPC or others. So it's very predictable what they believe. Like, you just tell me you're UPC, I could probably list all the things you believe, at least most of them. But those aside, I'm not like that. I actually don't belong to a denomination. I don't have a denominational set of beliefs. As far as I know, although I ascribe to things that can have predictions, like, say, uh, I'm not Reformed, but you could still call me Protestant. So I'm not Catholic, so you might have some prediction on those. But I have these other beliefs, and as far as I'm aware, I don't know of any other person that has all of my different beliefs synthesized like I do. And whether that's a good
Right.
or bad thing, I mean, that's up for individuals to decide. But I have your
Sure.
list here of suggestions. So just quickly, I'll go through that, and then I'm hoping whatever it is you're looking to find or learn, I might be able to provide something you haven't heard before, and I'm hoping you'll do the same for me. And I expect actually you'll probably have something good for me.
Sure.
So he said, I'm an atheist. I'm going to give you advice on converting atheists to Christ, which I'm not necessarily doing, but I think some of these points, I probably agreed with most of your points. But see, number one, when engaging in an argument, don't insist that you're right. In fact, acknowledge that you might be wrong, which is kind of what we touched on there. You don't have to believe that you are wrong, but admitting that you might makes your chance of conversion much greater, which is very true. The sincerity is important. It's perceived as hypothetical to expect others, I'm sorry, hypocritical to expect others to examine their beliefs without you being willing to examine yours. I tell Christians this a lot, and you're probably familiar with this verse, although some people, whether the historicity is accurate. Paul gives a failure criteria that if Christ isn't risen, Christianity is false.
Oh,
And Christians obviously believe the text, and they need to be willing to admit that it's falsifiable, at least in theory. So I think, yeah, that's absolutely true. You won't get any pushback from me. And not only, I like how you mentioned it's like, at least pretend that, right? Because you're going to get their attention better. I think it's also good to be open minded, and I think they have to remind themselves, like, there is a condition in which what we believe isn't true, at least on that level. I mean, I think there's many conditions, but that's the obvious one. So I guess there's
right.
really nothing to talk about there. I think that's exactly true. Your second one said, if the atheist tells you that they were once a Christian, don't argue with them. by remaining silent, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Yeah, it's like, oh, well, you weren't a real Christian. Like, it'd be really easy for a lot of denominational Christians to just dismiss your Pentecostalism. Like, oh, that's a cult. You'll probably hear someone say that. Um,
It's one of the biggest stumbling blocks to actually continuing a conversation. When you have somebody tell you that you weren't a Christian, and they get that from the Bible, although the Bible is actually, I'm going to use the word contradictory on that subject, depending on whether you're reading Hebrews or reading other works of Paul.
yeah,
Uh,
I appeared on some Reformed guys. I don't know, have you heard of the presuppositional approach of
oh
apologetics?
yeah, no,
So
it
this
drives me crazy. But
these two
yes,
guys run a show, and they do it from that perspective. I appeared as a guest on there just for like maybe 20 minutes, and they were trying to throw that at me. They were saying everyone really believes in God because they go to the verse that says it's been clearly perceived. I'm like, I don't think that's what that's saying, but anyway, yeah. I mean, I understand that the presup crowd is the one you're talking about, where they think everyone actually really believes in God, but
not just the precept crowd, but they're the
they're the
most
loudest ones. Yeah.
flagrant. Right, exactly.
But yeah, you'll get no pushback from me on that one. Don't discuss politics. I tell everyone that. Like, as soon as you put politics in it, it's like your integrity is shot. I don't like if you're really wanting to discuss Jesus, Christianity, or any kind of theological claim. You gotta pull the politics out, and it can be done. Some people will say for certain subjects you can't do it. I don't think that's true. In fact, I don't think any of my content has had anything political, not a single one, and it's not really that
Okay,
hard either. I don't know. I think some people
it's not.
some people are so politically partisan though. It's hard for them, I guess. I mean, I don't know, but yeah, if you didn't vote for Trump, yeah, pretty much everything there. Just keep the politics out of it. Like you can discuss whether it's PC or not. You can discuss, for example, whether being gay or even gay marriage is a sin without discussing the political aspect, because you mentioned that
Sure.
in your thing there. But yeah, so first, all 3 points are I'm good with. Let's see, for find common ground. Yes, in fact, if you ever get a chance, it's probably nothing you haven't heard before. But my very first video, it's a two-part series. The first video it's just called "Is Theism Rational?" I talked to an agnostic guy, and that was my approach. I was like trying to find common ground with him, and I was like, okay, let's go over like our beliefs about the world, our presuppositions, and what we share. I told him I suspected we probably shared more than we differed on, and then so I went to the point where we maybe differed to find out what it was, and we could talk about it. And for a lot of them, I thought I found one, but then he would kind of grant them for the sake of argument, just keep going. And it was a
Hmm.
pretty good talk. We had 2 parts to it. It probably should have had 3 parts, but I haven't heard from him in a while. I think he's kind of busy. But yes, finding common ground. That's the only. I think I want to get your opinion on this. That's how you can know if something is really sincere. Like if they try to do that, then like you can say, okay, they're actually talking with each other and to each other instead of past each other debating. Are they actually looking for, okay, we agree with this, we have this in common, okay, how can we use that to get to our next step to where we differ? And that's really where the substance is. So I was like, do you think that's true?
I absolutely, from my experience, 90%, sadly, and I don't think I'm exaggerating there, of the dialogues that I've had with Christian apologists, we spent the whole conversation talking past each other. Um, we don't have any commonalities. We're not even using common definitions of the same words. And if you're
Yes.
not using the same definition, you're not talking about the same thing. You're two different subjects, sometimes three different subjects.
Yes, and a lot of the things, although maybe not directly, that you're mentioning here is, even though we won't touch on any of them, is just as applicable in political discussions. Um,
Mhm.
in fact, maybe 1-to-1 ratio, these are equally applicable. If you're a young earther, anti-vaxxer, or pandemic was a hoax. I mean, that's a little political, except for the young earth part. Similar to number 3, I think that's true. I'm not sure young earthers have a lot they can do. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but they're not going to be able to find almost any common ground with anything. Um, Number 6, to avoid overused apologetic arguments, ego arguments, morality, the lunatic liar, Lord, Pascal's wager, minimal facts, presuppositionalism. Avoid using those. I think I agree with that one. My only caveat would be maybe it depends on your audience, because
Sure.
overused, they're overused on a popular internet level, but like some of mine, I give basic versions of them because they're very introductory to some people that were watching it that aren't familiar with it.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, I understand. In fact, if your audience, if this would be considered overused, any of those ones you list or other ones, it's better to get into, like, find the common ground, do that part, and that's what I did with the other guy. Find those common ground bits, see where they're no longer familiar with the details, and start from there. Um, and that play, I actually expected my guest to know a little more about certain arguments I was going into, so I was pleasantly surprised where like he kind of wasn't familiar with some. I'm like, oh, we can talk about that. Whereas maybe you or someone else would be like, this even this part's overused. So that, I guess that's my only caveat to that. But I actually think it's a good idea not to just repeat or regurgitate point for point something you've heard from Craig or Habermas, because they're likely to have heard before and it's not going to do anything for you.
If you look up um, the minimal facts argument as an example, it's regurgitated word for word on 500,000 web pages. Um, and having myriad copies of the same argument again and again and again doesn't increase the amount of proof, or it's not more evidence, it's just the same evidence regurgitated.
Yeah, and that's why it's
uh,
better to start with the common ground, and then when you get to the arguments, like we both know the premises and whatever, so you get to the very detailed bits where there's like
where things are
background
actually
information.
different,
Yeah, yeah, that's where it's productive. Which
right?
is what we're probably going to get to. I've got two more. Listen to what the atheist has to say. That's important. Yeah, and represent them accurately. When you make a good point, when they make a good point, concede it. Yes, that's hard for Christians to do. I'm going to be honest. It's hard for them to sincerely admit that this is a good objection. This is a good question. These are good points. Especially if they come from a pretense of having common ground in some areas. Like when you are in that context and they raise something, you can be like, yes, you're right, that would be a problem, or that's true. And then
Hmm.
I think that's, especially if with the premise of your post, if you're actually trying to convert that individual talking to you, like there's almost no other way to do it if you're using this sort of rational approach. And then lastly, avoid logical fallacies. So I'd like to think that's obvious, but the fallacy accusation is so thrown around. It's almost been cheapened. So I almost never even get on that. I mean, when it's so obvious that it can't be avoided, that someone's using something fallacious, if I'm talking to them and not like reviewing their argument, but if I'm talking to them directly, I
Sure.
would never accuse them directly. I don't think that would be very helpful. So that was your list. So yeah, I like your entire list. Fallacies are bad. And I made a comment about something, and then you responded to me and a bunch of people that have been, because you probably didn't have all day to respond to every comment. So you just kind of did a bulk
No,
response.
there was far more responses than I'd expected, and to be honest, there was far more responses that were thoughtful than
Mhm.
I'd expected.
I think it's
Um,
because of how sincere you came across. I think that really helped, which is something
oh,
I'm hoping
I'm
will
glad to
rub
hear that.
off.
Thank you.
I'm really hoping your sincerity rubs off on more of the Christians in the group. This group isn't bad. I mean, I'm in it so many that I don't know if I remember the nature of this group, but yeah, it's contagious. It really is. Being sincere and candid in what you're talking about can be contagious. I'm sure not. I didn't read all the comments because it did get a lot of attention and traffic. But your one bulk response was, I think, was the only one you included me in. You said, "I am an atheist. I am not hostile to theism. I don't think it's irrational. I'm just not a believer." And then I'm going to summarize some of it. You mentioned you don't believe in the resurrection, so you keep the logical side consistent. That's the sort of foundational belief of Christianity. So if you don't believe that, you're not Christian in any sense. And I think you mentioned how you actually still have a lot of respect for its influence and history and culture and stuff like that. And then from
Oh,
there,
definitely. Yeah.
that's where I was like, hey, you can talk to, like, you are the exact type of guest I want. Although I'll have many other guests. I mean, there's not a lot of you, so when I find you, I try to ask about it. And then we're here. So the first thing I will say that a lot of Christians won't say, and I'd like to think if you pressed them on it, they would agree with it. Although that the pressing them on it would require them to sit down and listen and take a while. I do not think it's compelling. The Christianity and theism aren't compelling, and I use that language, and I have my own little set of vocabulary I explain. What I mean by compelling is it's not so convincing and persuasive that it will impose itself on your beliefs that you have to believe it. It's not as compelling as anything you would consider compelling. So the most compelling thing might be your sense input. You see something, you believe it's there, like it
Sure.
imposes itself on you, or something that's just so logically undeniable, like certain mathematical proofs or anything that's so strongly scientifically believed. So I don't think it's compelling in that sense. But I also add caveats to that. I don't think it needs to be compelling. I might get into that more later, but I'll admit it's not
Sure.
compelling. It's not going to impose itself on you in any way. There's no argument that's going to be given. There's no experience or testimony that's going to be like, I have to believe this, especially if it's against your own incredulity. If someone is antagonistic or doesn't want to believe it, it's not going to just impose itself on you. And Christians a lot of times won't admit this because they want to say their faith is compelling. And maybe there's a better word there to use. I like that word though because to compel belief sounds very like it's imposing itself. But I think a lot of atheists and non-believers think it needs to be compelling to
Right.
rationally believe, and that's something I've addressed in my videos, that I'm trying to deconstruct that expectation that it's not compelling. So it's okay that you don't feel the need to believe it in a compelling way, like we have a lot of expectation with science. But it
Hmm.
doesn't need to be that way to rationally believe. I like to use the phrase rational permission. There's enough to where you have rational permission to believe it. Like you wouldn't have to be irrational to believe it. I think it meets that standard. And I honestly believe, because I think this is how beliefs work if you break it down enough, that if you sort of had a scale, I do think it tips more in favor of the belief. I don't think it's exactly balanced, but you don't necessarily have to think that way. So, at least that first part, not compelling, you'll probably agree with me. It's not compelling. Whether you agree it needs to be compelling or not, we'll probably come back to that. But I think that's the case. It's not compelling. And I really hope Christians approach it better that way because, one, it'll help them be more open minded, which I think at the end of the day, I would like to think we're all in the pursuit of truth. But I think a lot of Christians aren't. I think they are just straight up apologists trying to make it true. I understand that that's the case, maybe even with the majority of them. But I don't want to accuse anyone specifically because I don't really know.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it's not a compelling proposition. And I think the reason it's set up in the discourse that it needs to be is because of science and the success of natural sciences. I think that's really what it is. And they're treating theism specifically like it's a science, like the theology like it's some kind of science. And the methodologies of science and the presuppositions we have to hold to make it work, they try to infuse it with theological beliefs. And I don't think it works. And I think the reason that it doesn't work is the reason that a lot of people dismiss it, um, because they're just integrating these things. And it's not always necessary. And so I think this is where we can start our common ground attempts. I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of the vocabulary, so I'm going to use. Sometimes I'll say something and then I'll re-describe it in a different vocabulary to see if we're on the same page.
Sure.
But a lot of discussions will come down to sometimes it's called like logical positivism and those kind of things. And
Hmm.
you've probably heard, whether Craig said it or other apologists say it, that used to be really prominent and then it kind of went away, and then some people say it's really still there. I don't know how someone would prove that, but whether that's the case, if someone believes that science is the only form of knowledge or any version of that, then obviously theism, just in advance, is not an option. Whether Christians say it is or not, I'm saying it's not. I don't think
Right.
the methodologies of scientific knowledge can access a claim like theism. And so for a lot of people that means, well, therefore, not in advance, but therefore you can't have knowledge of theism because that's the only way to have knowledge. Like somehow all of knowledge can be reduced to that kind of knowledge. Maybe that's true. Actually, I'm not a strong epistemologist myself. I know a guy that's really into it, so maybe we could talk to him. But maybe that there's an argument for that. That eventually, if you reduce knowledge enough, it comes down to some sort of scientific version of inference. I don't believe that personally. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's sustainably true either. So, if you understand that, would you say we share that that's not necessarily true, or would you say in some way knowledge can be reduced to a sort of naturalistic science inference?
I don't think that it can be reduced to a naturalistic science inference. I think there are things that you can know, possibly even direct revelation from God, the Holy Spirit, whatever, because I'm not discounting the possibility of their existence. To me, most of that, however, are things that you can know are true because you can know them logically. I know, because I'm not a, what's the word, solipsist? I know that I am not simultaneously sitting in California.
I would agree with you. Yes.
That's pretty incontrovertible.
Yep.
And there are lots of things that are concomitant to that. God, that's a huge subject.
It is, yeah, and we don't have to go all the way into those, but as I'm starting the check boxes we share, the short version, I gave a little unnecessarily long version of it, but the short version is, would you consider yourself science only? And it seems like the answer is no. Okay, that's good.
No.
We
As
both
a matter
checked.
of fact, if you want to get technical, I favor metaphysically panpsychism. And for me, it very eloquently answers some of the hard questions of consciousness. Everything's consciousness. If you consider consciousness axiomatic, am I pronouncing that word correctly?
Yes, and there's other ways. You can say axiomatic.
Axiomatic, okay.
Yeah.
If consciousness is axiomatic, then you don't ask any other questions about it, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it's not elephants all the way down or turtles all the way down. There ultimately is the foundation, and for me, that foundation is logic, actually. But I think of logic differently than a lot of people do.
Yeah.
I describe logic as a description of the universe. Literally the way that things
we might
are,
get to that. That might come up as relevant, and we're probably going to, in some way, if we hash it out enough, check the same box. I'll do my best not to spend too much time on any one, because then the entire video is just that instead of the whatever it is. But you definitely won't hear from me anything about inner witness of Holy Spirit, because like, what's that supposed to do for you, So you won't hear that from me. Yeah. So even if it's true, it's not meant to be for you. It's meant for the person that has it. But you won't hear that from me. And there's one other thing. Usually when discussing this, if I'm going to go in the correct order, there's really no logical reason to discuss any Christian specific belief, Christian doctrine. If we don't have theism yet, then it doesn't really make a lot of sense to go there. It seems like you're already open. You said theism's a rational option, which is usually the only standard I'm trying to get to. If a person's willing to willing to admit, not believe, but admit that theism's a rational option, then as far as theisms go, I've done my job. And then from there, whether they believe in theism or not is actually up to them. Like, I can't really do much else for them at that point. It's a rational option.
Sure.
Do you believe it? And that if it's already rational, then there's something stopping them from believing it. In the video I did with the other guy, I said it's like there's a cube in their block of cubes. Something's missing if it's rational, but they still don't believe it. And whether it's preference or their background, it could be all kinds of things. And there's really no way for me to determine and fix that. So if a person's being sincere at seeking truth, and it's not just them trying to debate me, then it's up to them at that point to pursue whatever they think the next step is. Now, I think for us to make sure we are exactly on the same page, we can check a few more boxes. But I think with you saying you believe theism is a rational option, almost already kind of gets us there. Unless what you mean is that you don't necessarily think theists are irrational in their pursuit, but you don't necessarily think theism is as plausible an explanation of reality as other options. So there's
I
different
think
versions
that
of that.
I think that theism, I think both. I think that theism is as plausible as an explanation for the existence of the universe as any other explanation. Um, there comes a point where no matter how much evidence and how much logic you can arrange, have on your side, right? That the question is insoluble.
Well,
You're never going to
yeah.
know.
You're not going to
And
know with certainty, I'll agree. And I would also say
right.
you're not going to know in the same quality and type like you would know something in science. So if you're saying that, I think you're right. But I don't think that means we can just cavalierly say you can't know at all, because then that kind of
Oh,
presupposes that there's only one type of knowledge, which I don't think you're saying. But I think a lot of people say, like, we can't, like the guy, his name was Raul. He said, yeah, I think a creator is possible and some naturalistic mechanism is possible. They're both possible. We can't know. And implicit in that, I didn't really press him on it, is that we can't know in a sort of scientifically certain, empirical way, which he's right. I don't think we can know that. But I don't think it has to be that to have justifiable knowledge and inference to any of them. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what you're saying, right?
it it is, but there's a complicating factor possibly
Mm-hmm.
in that I don't necessarily think about knowledge and belief is the same in the same way that everybody does. Um, I don't think of knowledge and belief as being separate things. I think of knowledge as the word that we use to express extreme confidence, the highest degree of confidence that a belief is true. I think
Okay.
all knowledge is a belief, but not all belief is knowledge.
That
Um,
is that's a good explanation. I actually really like that, especially in everyday use. When I say I know something, it usually has that connotation of certainty. Is that kind of what you mean? There's like that connotation of certainty.
right.
Okay.
It has the connotation of certainty. So I certainly believe that there are things that you can know. Think of it as a continuum,
Mm-hmm.
right?
That's how I like to do
That
it.
that that you can know to the degree or to the extent that that you would have to have something that was hard physical evidence to contradict that level of certainty,
Okay.
right?
Oh yeah, 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 for sure.
I mean, put it this way. I am absolutely 100% certain that I am not simultaneously sitting in Seattle, right? However, if well, today you can do anything with CGI,
Yeah,
but
and
if you could somehow demonstrate to me, right, that in fact, and I can't think of any way that you could demonstrate this, but if you could somehow demonstrate to me that I was in fact sitting in Seattle, well, then I would have to rethink, well, everything.
yeah, well, I mean, I think we're on the same page here because, and that's goes back to your get on the same page on your vocabulary, because with that understanding of the word knowledge, which I think you're right, a lot of you know, no, I know this has that empirical and certainty connotation. I think you're right. In
Mm-hmm.
that sense, I don't think you can know. So I can revise what I said with that correct understanding of your vocabulary. No, you can't know any of those theistic things with certainty. So when I say you can have knowledge, I'm meaning in the sort of epistemic sense, like the Aristotelian sense of a justified true belief or plus, or that's still debated. But so in that sense, belief and knowledge are still different in the sense that belief is being convinced some proposition is true, and then if you're using some version of the Aristotelian idea of knowledge, knowledge would be believing something that's true that is actually true, and you have some kind of warrant for believing it. And then some people are still debating whether there's something else, but whether that or not, I think you can have that kind of knowledge without the certainty aspect. But yeah, certainty and empirical certainty, I don't think is
I
necessarily
would
possible with
say
theism.
that you can effectively know something. The problem is that we don't always know what we know. In other
Yes.
words, it's possible for me to be 100% correct in a belief that I hold, but for the wrong reasons.
That's
I've arrived at the right conclusion.
there's a sample. I don't know if you've I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right. I think it's Gettier, the Gettier cases. It
I know
touches
what you're
on,
talking.
yes,
I think
it's
it's
like
Gettier. I think it is Gettier. Yeah.
he was basically challenging Aristotle's idea of knowledge and coming up with these examples like, okay, here's a belief, it's true, he had warrant for it, but no one would really say they know those things because it was like sort of accidental. I won't go over the cases here. I think I have answers to that, by the way, but either way, I think you're right. We can't have that kind of certainty knowledge of God existing, Jesus rising from the dead, any of those things. But I still maintain the thing I said before, which is I don't think you need that to be rational to believe in them. And I don't think that should be the standard we hold them to. Now, a lot of people will disagree with that, and that's totally fine. I actually understand why they would, because they're thinking of them in the context of other things we would demand certain types of evidence for, to have that level of certainty. And then I'll say one other thing about you said 100% a couple of times. If I'm being super nitpicky, I would probably say the only thing I'm 100% on is that I exist in the sort of Cartesian
Oh,
sense.
entirely agree.
I'm 100% on
Absolutely.
that, and then
Yeah.
everything else is probably in the 90s, and it just kind of goes down that gradient.
Yeah.
But that's a little nitpicky. So.
Exactly. The only thing that I know with absolute certainty is that I exist. That's it.
Okay.
Everything else, that does not mean, and again, this is one of these words that I see written down more than I hear pronounced. I am not a solipsist. To me, that's sort of a useless conjecture, even if it's true. It doesn't make any difference
Yeah.
because I'm going to continue to live my life as if I exist,
Yep. Yeah.
whether I do or not.
I don't think anyone really is between you and me. I don't think anyone really is. But I actually brought that up I was reviewing a video by Aaron Ra on the concept of faith, and usually people, especially non-believers, will say faith is believing something without evidence. And I said I think there's an appropriate context to use faith to mean that, even though I don't think anyone really, if you really examine what it would mean to believe something with no reason at all, it's just random. So no one really believes it that way. It's just usually their evidence is something someone else would say doesn't count. So therefore, you're believing
Right.
something with no evidence. But that's a whole. We've been talking about epistemology for the last couple of minutes because it is relevant. I think we're on
Mm-hmm.
the same page of certainty and knowledge. Usually, when you hear me use the word knowledge, I will say not empirically certain knowledge. I mean in this sort of Aristotelian sense. But I think you can also use the word rationally believe to imply the same thing. And I usually actually use that phrase. I'll say it's not irrational to believe this, even if you're not certain. Now, would you agree with this? That a lot of, and this is a sort of analysis I gave a moment ago, that a lot of blockage in the dialogue between theism and atheism is that exact problem, which is the sort of standard of evidence, what it means to be rational to believe something, having knowledge, whatever that is. That actually, all the other things they talk about, all the arguments and the premises and the assumptions and the axioms, all these things, it actually a lot of time comes down to those barriers. Whether or not this counts. Like this doesn't even count because the standard I have for believing in this scientific theory or whatever it is, is different, and it doesn't meet that standard, and it needs to meet that standard, but they don't necessarily say that, but it's like implicit in their objection. And I'm not getting that from you. You seem to be admitting that the certainty is not necessarily needed to be rational. Um,
Certainty isn't, largely because you can't be certain about everything. We accept things every day. When my wife just went to the store, and I wouldn't have let her go if I had to depend on the certainty that she would arrive back. Heck, I wouldn't leave
well,
the house
okay,
if I had to be certain.
that's a good point. So that leads me to where we may part ways a little. If we're talking about 100%, a lot of things we say we're
Mhm.
certain about, if like the Cartesian example might be the only one. So
Sure.
nothing else is even 100%, even if we use the loose vocabulary of it. I don't even think theism or the resurrection, whatever, has to be really, really high. I don't even think it needs to be really high to be rational. I think in a hypothetical sense, it would at least need to cross 50. I don't know how you would measure any of those things, of course, so I'm not going to say it needs to be measured. But I don't think a lot of people are even treating it that it needs to have the degree of certainty that we would need for the scientific propositions. And that's what I was referring to when I was comparing those.
Right. No, it doesn't need the degree of certainty that we'd require for an empirical validation, right?
Good.
Um, my reasons for, do you want me to go into why I don't believe I'm not going to say, I don't know the resurrection didn't occur. It might have, right? I look at it like this. There's hundreds of thousands of people a year who resuscitated. That's not unusual. There's 500,000 people roughly in the US who not in a hospital are resuscitated, uh, you know, just at a restaurant, and you have about a 40% chance of surviving if someone who knows what they're doing administers CPR, as an example, right?
Well, yeah, the
At least
resurrection.
surviving until you get to the hospital. The only
Yeah.
reason I say that is because resurrection, even though they name 10 different people in the Bible who were resurrected, and then there were groups of disciples who were also resurrected, and they don't specify the number. But as Jesus ascended, as I recollect, they were resurrected. But still, if you're looking at the billions of people on Earth, resurrection isn't a common occurrence.
So I think I have, I don't want to say an answer. I have responses you might be interested in that. But from
Mm-hmm.
my earlier point, I usually don't touch Christian specific stuff until I've dealt with theism. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of arguments for theism we could go over, but you've already pretty much, I don't want to say conceded, but you've um, mentioned that you think it's rational. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's good. Like, we're good to go there. If you have a question for me, I guess I'm about willing to pivot to the resurrection if you wanted to talk about it. So, do you have any questions for me about my understanding of theism and its relationship to the arguments and evidence and those things, or are you good on that?
I I think I think I understand where you're coming from. Um,
So, for
I don't understand. I don't know. Uh, I can't know in an internal sense why you're a theist.
I was actually just about to say that. So, if someone just that's never talked to me before, maybe doesn't really, maybe they don't have a position on theism, they're not like hard atheist, they're not like saying no God, but they're saying, so what reason would you give me? I'd probably give them a lot of the similar arguments you've heard before, but maybe I wouldn't give them the same way. But I would give similar reasons, maybe about causation or logic or whatever it is. I would give them so probably nothing you haven't heard before. It would depend on the individual though. So how I present or which one I would choose depends on what background information they already have, and then I would present it in that way. In fact, if you really want to dig deep, I could maybe give you some if you have a question, but you could watch that video. It's called "Is Theism Rational?" We pretty much just talk about the a version of the cosmological argument. Like, is there, the nature of time? Is there a sort of first causation? What does that mean? What is that thing? What would it mean to describe it as that? I describe it as God. That we basically
Hmm.
go over that. It's like that would be a reason I would give him. And it's also having the appropriate conception of theism. You gave a brief description at the beginning about like a omniscient, all that. You said super being, but I think a lot of the time they're not on the same page on that either. Whether it's a vocabulary thing or a conception thing, or both.
Hmm.
I think I would never actually describe it as a super being, but that would depend on who I'm talking to. Whether that language would be
Hmm.
appropriate for them. Because I don't think it's just some being that's very very powerful as a part of the rest of the world. I actually don't think that's what God is.
Right.
I don't think any Christian, if you press them enough, would say that's what God is. Maybe there's sort of euphemisms of describing it that way, but that doesn't mean that that's really what the reality is. And I think naturalists or atheists and theists will actually think along the same lines and to believe the same things, but the vocabulary barrier will not let them get to that. And and I think you're a lot more open
Sometimes
to
you
the
have to use
consciousness
the
too.
metaphor
Hmm. Yeah.
to make the conversation. So no, if I was thinking about God, as I literally thought about God, I wouldn't think of him as an entity or a super being, right? Um, the problem for me is that the standard description for God, when you go beyond the omniscient, omnibenevolent, all of that,
Hmm.
um, is that he lives or that he exists outside of time and space. Um,
Yeah, that's one way to describe it. I mean, I've actually, as I've matured, I've been trying to get Christians away from the description of outside of, at least the outside of time part, because
oh,
um,
thank you,
I'm trying
thank
to get
you.
them away from that because it's not useful. It's not necessary. Existing outside of space, um, it's not quite as egregious as outside of time, but I don't know if that's necessary. I mean, I think it can be an accurate way to describe it. Now, speaking with precision on these things, I don't know how precise we really have to be sometimes because we can appropriately understand a concept enough without having a degree of precision in many other areas. It almost not I'm not saying you're doing this, but a lot of unbelievers when talking they'll get need unnecessary specifics as if they really have no idea what we're talking about. I think a lot of time people, and I'm not getting this from you, are being really disingenuous with that. So for example, if we say it's spaceless, exists spacelessly, if you really wanted to, you could pick that apart so much that we don't have a high level of precision in describing that, especially as spatial beings, that sure you can't describe it with that level of precision. But I could give so many examples in science where we have just as much lack of precision, but to say we have no concept at all of what we're talking about wouldn't be true. And I think the same can be
It's not
true with God.
it's not the space aspect that I have any reservations about. Actually, it's the time,
Oh well, you've picked the
because
perfect person then.
for me, time is a measure of change. That's it,
Exactly.
right? If the universe existed at 0 degrees Kelvin, pardon me, there would be no time because there would be nothing that changed.
Well,
I wouldn't be
yes,
able to say.
it
So you
would.
see what I'm saying?
Yes, and I actually completely agree with you. And I think there would at least be no time within that arena. I mean, if there's some other universe somewhere, you could say
There might,
there's
yeah,
time.
in some other universe,
But
yeah.
time can get tricky, of course. There's a lot of things, and I think while it's an interesting discussion and it can be important, I think a lot of time it's not necessary for the, like for example, you and I don't have to get into the very nitpicks of time theory and the metaphysics of that. Although that is a
Mhm.
really interesting subject, I'd love to do videos on that sometime. But yeah, no, totally. I believe God is in time. I believe God is temporal. I don't think it's necessary to say that God is outside of time or always timeless. That's a You can describe a model of theism where that kind of works to explain certain things, but I think the temporal explanation is superior. And I've been talking to Christians about it, and I think when you press them enough, they'll agree to it. And Craig's even gone over some of that stuff. Like he said, I believe it's a true thing to say God exists right now, and that's a tensed statement. And so if God is outside of time, you almost can't even say that. So it's I don't know. But anyway, so yes,
There are many ways in which I admire Craig a lot.
Mhm.
I admire Craig hugely. He's not a young earth creationist, and he doesn't apologize for that. And
Good for
as
him.
an evangelical, to speak against young earth creationism requires some bravery.
Well, that was the
Um,
Kevin guy, the Ark Ministry guy. That was I did 2 videos with him, help trying to present a case of rational Christianity that doesn't have to believe in young Earth creationism. And it's such a
right,
hard subject for a lot of Christians to even talk about and not accuse you of heresy, even though it's never been
right.
considered an actual heresy. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm right in line with you. I don't think you need to describe God as being outside of time or timeless, always timeless at least.
No,
And
because if you do, from my perspective, it's nonsensical. I mean, if he existed if he did, if something existed outside of time, it would mean he had done nothing for all eternity.
well,
You know,
I
because
think there's a coherent description and even maybe the better description to say that God is timeless under X condition. But to say God is outside of time, like that, always timeless, I think you're right. I
mhm.
think that's an inferior explanation of certain beliefs about God and God's knowledge. I don't think you need to
you're
ascribe to the
actually the
timeless.
first. You're actually the first theist I've ever heard say
No,
that.
Craig
So
says
I'm I'm
Craig says
I'm
that.
happy.
Craig says that.
Craig says that.
Hmm.
I guess um, the only thing that I see there's on guard and reasonable
Oh,
faith.
look at that.
I just
Can you see
I
it?
just reread On Guard again recently.
Uh,
Um,
I'm gonna if can the audience? It's right here, right above my finger. Look at that. Yeah,
what's that?
the book. It's on
Oh,
guard. Yeah, I don't know if you can see it.
ah, that's a good book. I
Yeah,
like it a little bit more than I do Reasonable
it's an
Faith.
easier read than Reasonable Faith. I'll
Yeah.
admit that it's an easier read. But yeah, I like Craig a lot too. There's some theological things we differ on that are Christian specific, so usually not worth going over. But
So my friend Peter, um, I think William Craig was his professor actually.
that's really cool. Yeah,
Uh,
he's
yeah.
definitely the
So he
most
sort of.
popular today for this generation. He's definitely the most
Oh
popular.
yeah, yeah,
And I'm
yeah, definitely.
what made him so good was that he is a scholastic level guy, but he brings it down to a popular level. And through most of history, the scholars they call it the ivory tower, right? Where the scholars and the lay people are just so disconnected. And that's still kind of true with science, but there are people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and others that are trying to do the same thing with science, and it's actually really awesome. So I'm hoping that trend continues in all the other scholastic areas. That there's appropriate popularizers. Even although I think there's a lot of things I don't like about him, even Richard Dawkins with biology did a decent job. I think he did a pretty good job of bringing complicated scientific knowledge to a popular level.
He did the Blind Watchmaker, the Selfish Gene.
Hmm.
When I read the Blind Watchmaker 25 years ago, however long ago it was a stunningly lucid book for me.
Yeah, I
It
love all those
explained
things. Yeah,
yeah.
and Carl Sagan was
So,
obviously really big, but that was before my time.
Demon Haunted World, I love that book. So the only thing that the only reservation that I have, the only problem I have with Craig is that you're reading Reasonable Faith
Uh-huh.
and you watch his numerous YouTube videos from different debates that he's in. And at one point in Reasonable Faith, he says, but even if, essentially, even if nothing that I argue here is correct, I would still believe. Um, and he even addresses you know, a Mormon will say, but I know. And a Muslim will say, but I know, etc. Well, that's sort of throwing mud on all of the arguments that you've just given. You don't need to make the arguments if you're going to believe X regardless. In other words, I don't like that he has it both ways.
Yeah, I don't know how original that is. I think that actually comes from Plantinga, which Craig's a big fan of Alvin Plantinga, in his
I'm
Reformed
actually a
Epistle.
big fan of Alvin Plantinga myself.
Oh yeah,
His
he's a big smart boy.
Sensus
Yeah.
Divinitatis. Yeah,
Oh, he's a good example of he's in the ivory tower. He's not as talented at making it popular, but Craig is, and so he's also from the ivory tower. And he takes a lot of Plantinga stuff and brings it down. So he gets a lot of that from Plantinga in his Reformed epistemology, and
and he's Craig is also not very welcoming to Habermas, which pleases me as well because I think the minimal facts argument is a really bad one.
I mean,
Um,
I usually don't get into I mean, they're definitely still like colleagues. In fact, I went to a conference where they were both there and interacting. But yeah, I mean, they're not going to. No two people are going to agree on every finer point. I don't think.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't think Craig uses minimal facts. Now, the thing I'm
he
not trying to
doesn't.
be.
No,
I'm not trying to be a Craig apologist. I do think he's what you said. I mean, he's mentioned that maybe in different contexts, but he's addressed your question. I don't know if you've seen it. And he has, if you want a detailed version, he has questions of the week on his website. I think he addressed that exact question where it's
I'm on
like,
his mailing list. I get an email from reasonablefaith.com, I think at least weekly.
yeah, I do, but I don't check any of that stuff to be honest. It's too much. But yeah, I mean, it just that alone, I would agree is inadequate. Just saying, well, even if everything I said isn't a good argument, I would still believe on this basis.
I
He
commend him for his honesty. I
Well,
do
he's
commend
saying
him
that
for
in a
his.
very specific context, not saying you should believe it no matter what. Because in the same context where he said those things, he's mentioned contexts where it would be irrational to believe or you shouldn't believe. In fact, I think Eddie and in the Beer and Bible Consortium, they had these questions, and he addressed that. He's like, if this isn't true, you shouldn't believe it. So like he's saying in the context that if it's actually true and this is the case, but I don't want to defend that because I don't think that's necessary. Because again, it's not for you. It's not for the person he's talking to. It's for the sort of individual. And Plantinga even gives the example where if you are accused of a crime and all of the circumstantial evidence is against you, but in your own experience you never actually you didn't commit the crime, so you know you didn't commit the crime, would you be
Right.
rationally compelled because the circumstantial evidence is against you to say maybe I hallucinated all of my other experiences and I actually committed? Well, no. And that's kind of what Craig's saying. Well, I should be more accurate. That's what Plantinga is saying, and Craig's just reiterating that in his own
Okay.
way. That's what he means. Now, there's objections to that point of view. In fact, I talked to a guy named T Jump, and he there's a whole section of scholars that don't agree with the Reformed epistemology. So that's a debate that I usually don't care to get into. I have other things I care about, but yeah, I think you've been checking all my same boxes, and I'm actually okay to move to the resurrection.
Sure.
If you
Anything you want.
well,
I'm enjoying myself.
you don't consider yourself a theist, so I'm wondering before we do, because as you're learning about me and you're talking to me, you're probably learning. I have my own sort of flavor of theism Christianity, although it's still orthodox in the sense. So, do you have any last questions for me about theism before we move on to that?
I don't actually, because we've covered pretty much anything that I would have asked already in our conversation.
Okay, cool. So, for the resurrection, when you're considering it, whether you're looking at the evidence or the argument and all that stuff, would you say, at least in a sincere consideration of that from a rational perspective, would you say in your background information God exists to consider that? Whether you actually believe it or not.
I'm sorry. One more time. I'm not quite understanding the question.
Okay, so you don't consider yourself a theist, but in the rational order, the appropriate order to approach these issues, would you when you're considering the resurrection for the sake of argument, would you say that God exists in your background information when examining the evidence?
So, are you asking me that if I believe that the resurrection had occurred, could I infer from that the existence of God? Is that what you're asking?
No, it's a little backwards. So, for example, when you're looking, did Jesus rise from the dead? When you ask that question, does God exist in your background information of the world as a part of your system of beliefs. Not necessarily literally, because you don't call yourself a theist, but at least for the sake of examining the argument, for argument's sake. So let me give you an example. Let me explain it better, I guess. So I'm presented with the claim Jesus rose from the dead. I have beliefs before I'm presented with that. I believe I'm real. I believe the natural world is real, operates according to laws of physics, blah, 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 blah. And I may or may not believe God exists. So let's say I don't. I'm an atheist naturalist. I believe there's no God. Nature's all that exists. So if someone says Jesus rose from the dead, sort of in advance, that's impossible. It couldn't have happened. Now on the flip side, let's say I'm not a naturalist. I'm a theist, but I'm not a Christian. Someone presents that to me. God raised Jesus from the dead. That's the claim. It's hypothetically possible in my worldview. I don't believe it necessarily. Maybe the evidence isn't compelling. For a Christian, could say the same thing about Muhammad being ascended to heaven. Hypothetically, that's
Right.
possible because there's an omnipotent God that exists in their background information. So my question to you is, when you examine the resurrection, for the sake of argument, when you're examining that in the correct order of beliefs, does God exist in your background information? Does that make more sense?
Um, yes. Um,
Okay, that's really all I need. And I'm not saying you actually have to believe in God for that. I'm just saying, when hypothetically examining it, you wouldn't say, I'm examining this under naturalism, like John Dominic Crossan does, or the Jesus Seminar, because like that's a sort of, I think that's a slightly disingenuous way to approach it, because it's not what the claim is. In fact, that was one of the things I was going to address, because you mentioned that when going over briefly way back on the resurrection, about this person, resurrection claims happen and maybe they're not really, all these things. So that context, I think, is important if we're going to talk about the resurrection. But even a lucid yes, or like, sure,
so
is good enough.
I could accept that the resurrection occurred, or I could consider it. I'm not saying that it's irrational even now, but it's a belief that I could adopt with the right evidence and logic, whether it was a natural claim or a supernatural claim or a
Okay.
supernatural claim,
Okay.
but it would have to be different evidence and different logic.
Okay, that's fair. In fact, that's really all I needed, because as long as it's not automatically in advance impossible to be some sort of supernatural event, that's really all you need.
No, I don't. I do not reject the possibility of the supernatural.
Okay, cool. So with that, I don't want to try to steal anyone's approach. Minimal facts, Harry, Craig, whatever. So I just talk about it from what I know in my background, and I'm obviously no expert, but neither are you. We're not experts. We don't need to be.
No.
So you're probably already familiar with the entire background of this debate, the resurrection debate, with the historical case and this and all that nonsense. So I already have a short video on the resurrection. It's one of my most recent ones. There's probably nothing in that video you've never heard, so I'm not going to recommend it to you. It's meant more for someone. It's meant for the person that's never heard it before, and more importantly, maybe are theists and are wondering what's the rationale to believe in Christianity. So it just lays out the cases, like the reason Christians are what they are is because they believe this event. So I'll lay out a simple. I don't want to lay out the case because I know you've heard it before. So what I'm going to do is lay out in my way a sort of approach. So if you're being purely rational, it's a historical claim. It's a claim of something that happened in history that you and I didn't observe, or anyone that we know. There's not necessarily modern versions of verification like cameras or whatever. There's none of that. Now, for a lot of people, that's already enough reason to say you can't have any rational belief about it. Now, I don't think you're saying that, and I think if you press someone enough, they don't really say that either, because then you pretty much have to throw out the entire canon of historical knowledge, which I don't think a lot of people would sincerely do. I think a lot of people might do it in the case of Christianity, being incredulous, but people have historical beliefs, especially in the political realm. There's plenty of historical beliefs about what America used to do and stuff. If you apply the same skepticism, you can, I don't think you're going to do that. So usually what happens is you establish what do you consider are the historical facts relevant to the resurrection, and then Craig usually will say what's the best explanation of the facts. Now in the explanation section, because I don't know whether we'll agree on what the facts are, but in the explanation section, I'm okay using the same historical methodology we would use for any other historical claim, with the openness and background openness of God existing. So that's really the only caveat. And that explanation criteria, which you kind of, it's not even just history, but it's specifically used for that, is explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, ad hocness, and how well it fits all other criteria better than its competing explanations. That's the sort of layout I use. Now, obviously, most people, when they believe something happened or not, especially in history, it's not like they're going through that process in their mind, like, okay, this one, like that's not really how our brains work. Usually, it's just some historian says it, so I believe it. That's usually how people of history work. This is the expert; they say it, I believe it. Now, in the case of the resurrection specifically, obviously, a historian can't say that. It's a supernatural event. So that part is up to the individual, whether they're open to it and they're seeking that. But I think, for the most part, the historical context can be established. Now, I don't know what you believe, and so I'm about to find out by asking you. I'm going to assume, I hope it's not a bad assumption, but I don't think it is, that you're not a Jesus mythicist, that Jesus never existed. Or
I'm not a Jesus mythicist.
Okay, that's cool.
I have read and enjoyed Richard Carrier's, and I forget his first name, but Price's works on the subject, and they've had some interesting points, but no,
Yeah.
I'm not a mythicist.
I mean, that's true. I think they do, and but I don't know how any more useful that is. I mean, you can make an interesting point about almost anything. I've kind of recently been delving into flat earth theory, but not for myself, but because I find it an interesting analogy to a lot of things. I use it mostly against young earth creationists, but they can make some interesting points too. But I think especially Carrier, as far as I know, is the only guy who flourished with Jesus mythicism that's ever actually had something peer-reviewed in the area of the historicity of Jesus, and it wasn't even about that. There's actually nothing that's peer-reviewed that makes a case that Jesus didn't exist. And that's why even people like Bart Ehrman will say, atheists, stop saying this. Stop. It makes you look bad. So I'm glad you don't, because it's really hard to really talk with someone about that. Now, maybe you don't agree with a lot of the other facts, but I'm glad we can start there and have a common ground on that one.
Well, I mean, pretty much, if you read the Ehrman book, and I'm not remembering the name of it, but it wasn't a response to the Carrier book, but there wasn't that many years between them. I believe Ehrman was correct. It's mythicism is an embarrassment, or should be an embarrassment to atheists.
You can't seriously talk with someone about it. It's like trying to talk with a young Earth creationist about evolution. You can't do it because there's a huge premise missing from that shouldn't be missing. It's a fact that they don't believe, and that's true with Jesus. I think, if I'm going to be honest, I think a lot of people are doing that because it's an easy out when debating. You just try to raise skepticism about Jesus, and Jesus is a contentious religious figure, but his existence isn't. But they want to make it one because it's an easy out. Like, if Jesus didn't exist, I don't have to address your arguments. There is no Jesus. And that's not on the same caliber as the claims that Moses didn't exist. Those are not the same caliber, because the claims that Moses didn't exist is different. Now, technically, if you want to be technical, we can't say there's no historical figure that Moses could have represented. We just can't verify the events of Exodus with our historical methods. Like, we don't have corroborating evidence of that. That's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can infer there is no historical person of Moses. Maybe that was a romanticized story. Maybe it was true in some way. Who knows? But that's not analogous to Jesus mythicism.
It's not.
A lot of people try to it's like, well, Moses didn't exist. And it's like, no. So I'm glad that's true.
Can I point out one thing here?
Sure.
That because a lot of people don't get, I'm sure you do, The words evidence and proof in common usage are synonymous, but they're not synonymous in actual fact.
Yes.
So evidence are data or information that you have that suggest that something might be true. Proof is an accumulation of evidence, the weight of which
Compels you.
demonstrates
Yeah.
that something is likely true.
I
You know, not to 100% because nothing is at 100%.
it,
But
that's
yeah,
exactly right. And if you maybe you'll like my channel. I don't know. Maybe you should subscribe because I use the exact same thing. Like my girlfriend was interviewing me, so to speak, because she's exploring Christianity, and she keeps using the word prove. She means it in the loose colloquial sense as evidence, but just in case, I said the exact same thing you said. I'm like, I don't think we need to have proof as if it has some degree of empirical certainty, but reasons, evidence, exactly. So, exactly. In fact, you probably won't hear me use the word proof. I don't think I've said it yet, because I think it just has that connotation that's going to put an expectation to a degree that's going to hinder rational reflection. So yes, no, I wouldn't say we have proof that Jesus rose from the dead. I wouldn't say we have proof that any of those historical facts are highly certain. But yeah, I wouldn't even say we have proof Jesus existed, although I think its degree is pretty high. I wouldn't say we have proof. I think that's a little too loaded to talk about. So that's the first one I started with. Now, I assumed you weren't a Jesus mythicist, but I had to let you speak for
no,
yourself.
not a mythicist.
The second one is that Jesus was crucified and died. Would you say you believe that?
Uh, I'll say probably. I mean, it's a historical claim, assuming the existence of Jesus, the historicity of Jesus, which I am assuming. Um,
Actually,
Crucifixion was not an uncommon means of putting a criminal to death.
let me back up for a second before I ask that one. That would be the next historical fact I would go over in terms of saying, here's why I believe the resurrection. But do you think we have any historical knowledge about Jesus aside from him existing? Can we know anything in a historical sense like we would know about any other figure of history? Do you think we have anything? Or is it all equal? Or do you think there's some that are
Well,
more than others?
here's how I think of history. Um, the past and history are again those words are used synonymously often, but they're not. The past is not accessible to us, right? History is a reconstruction based on the evidence, whether that evidence is ancient documents or from an archaeological dig, etc. We try to reconstruct what we think most likely happened, what was most likely true about that time. So I don't think that we know anything concrete about Jesus's life, with the possible exception of what we have recorded in the Synoptic Gospels.
So, okay,
Um,
I think you're right about your explanation of historical knowledge and stuff. But you understand my question, right? Like, if I asked you if you believe the Holocaust happened, you'd say yes, right? You wouldn't have to give
yes,
me
I
all
would.
that. You
Yeah.
wouldn't have to give me all that, right? So if I asked you, do you believe Jesus was crucified? Can you also say yes? Do you say no? Do you say I don't know? Which is it? You could say yes, but maybe not with the degree of the Holocaust. But would you say yes?
I would have to say I don't know. It's not a historical improbability,
Well,
right?
well, can I stop you for a sec, if you don't
Assuming,
mind? I don't mean to interrupt,
hmm?
but would you say the same thing about the Holocaust?
Well, no, but we have
We have.
tens of thousands of,
Mhm.
you know,
So,
photos of
so
the.
okay, I believe you're right. You're right, and I would. So, is it for you? Is it a matter of degree? Is it just that we don't have the same degree of information, so I can't say yes? Is that kind of what you're telling me, or is it like there's a different methodology? It like I just want to make sure we're on the same page before. I don't want to confuse the audience.
Well, it's a matter of time. Uh,
Okay.
so, I mean, I remember the first president I remember was Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? So unless I hallucinated him, uh, or all of the history books have lied, the photos were faked, etc., I'm pretty confident that Lyndon Baines Johnson existed. But as an example, whether Robin Hood did or whether King Arthur did, we don't know.
Well, what
And
about I'm not sure those are the best examples. How about a really good example is I forgot, I'm drawing a blank here. Plato's predecessor. What was his name?
Eric, I know who you're talking about. Socrates.
Do you think Socrates existed?
To be honest, I've wondered that many times. I've wondered whether he was sort of a
Some people
character.
some people argue he was a character. Now, I
Yeah.
think the
So I don't
consensus is
know.
that
I
there's someone that was really him. Maybe the stories aren't exactly accurate, but that there is someone that he was a real person, but we don't have the perfect record. How about, do you think Spartacus existed?
I'll be honest. I don't know about outside of the motion picture. I don't know enough about. I'm embarrassed to admit this.
That's
I
okay.
don't even know whether Spartacus was supposed to have been a real person. I've watched Kirk Douglas, I think, play him in a movie
Okay,
from,
he was. There's
he
a real
was,
historical
okay.
record. Now, we don't have perfect knowledge of it, and there's a lot of dramatizations of it, but it's based on real historical events. Okay, do you believe Alexander the Great existed?
Well, yes.
Okay, okay. If you don't mind me stopping you there for a second, I'm just getting a degree of quality of these, and it's fine. It's actually okay to answer because I would answer those in a similar order that you did. I would answer it a little slightly differently. But like, for example, my degree in Socrates is lower than Alexander, which is lower than the Holocaust, and so on. And I'm just getting the reason I use those specific examples is because they do bear a certain relationship and quality to Jesus in different degrees. So, for example, I'm not going to lay it perfectly out, but obviously the highest of all those is the Holocaust. It's the most recent, which is the main thing. And I obviously time makes a difference, but there's two types of time. There's the time when it happened, and the time between its documentation and when it happened.
Right.
And the evidence itself doesn't get worse over the lapse of time, but the event's certainty of recent memory does. So recent memory of the Holocaust or 9/11 are much better today than the recent memory of Jesus, and which
Right.
is even better than Socrates. So, and 2,000 years from now, the Holocaust will be probably almost in as much doubt as Jesus is, if we're being honest. But
Probably,
it
sadly,
shouldn't.
but
But we
probably,
know
yeah.
it shouldn't be. Maybe it actually won't because our documentation is more sophisticated. But it's actually going to be hard to project that accurately because who knows what the nature of reality will be like then.
Right.
But I use those exact examples on purpose because I think there's a gradient there of quality of evidence, and of which all of those people I mentioned are agreed, especially in the scholarship, to be real people. And I didn't use Robin Hood or King Arthur on purpose because those are of a different quality. And I'm wondering if you treat Jesus as one of those two. Would you put Jesus closer to the camp of the ones I mentioned or of Robin Hood and King Arthur?
Well, I think of him as a character uh, as likely historically as um, Julius Caesar, uh, Socrates,
Okay.
etc. I don't doubt that he existed. I don't know that he did. And for my own interest, the important question is only whether the resurrection itself was likely,
No, that's
because
true.
that's the central claim.
No, I think you're right. And the only reason I'm going through this is to get to a spot where you can understand why I believe it. Right.
Ah, okay.
So,
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
and because I mean, otherwise there's really no point in asking me, right? But um, I think you could. Would you use that same answer that you just gave me about? I mean, you think you probably did, and obviously, and this is true with all figures of antiquity. There's things we can know and things that were uncertain, things we're pretty sure didn't happen. There's those kind of three branches. And would you give that same answer about Alexander the Great? That yeah, he was probably a real person, or would you say no? I'm pretty confident he was a real person.
Well, Alexander the Great, as far as I know, has his face on coins, uh, and has a pretty unbroken line of, I don't want to say succession, but he was supposed to have conquered, you know, he visited lots of different countries where he's in their history books as well. Um, Jesus only had a small area that he was actually supposed to have
That's true. Yep.
sojourned in. Um, so not quite to the same level,
No,
but I
that's true.
am.
Now having things on coins, I mean, there's depictions of Jesus on glass stains that precede that. But what is
Mhm.
true, I think you're right. Now, when it comes to historical sources, though, that we use the same criterion for verifying ancient history, there's actually less sources on Alexander the Great that were written with a larger
They were
time gap.
contemporaneous,
No, they weren't contemporaneous. There were
right?
no contemporaneous sources there in the time, and there's very rarely contemporaneous ancient history. But the time between the sources are longer than Jesus. And now I think now Alexander the Great is a little more recent, but I think in terms of source material, like if we're being a scholar about it, I think you would want
Hmm.
to at least admit that you would believe in Jesus on the same degree, or maybe higher, because we have more sources that were written closer to the events on a more diverse section, and that's more significant given he was a relatively minor figure compared to Alexander the Great. Now, that this we're not merely talking about him existing anymore. I'm talking about whether we can have some degree of quality of facts or things we can know about Jesus. Anything. Is there anything we can know beyond him just existing? And that doesn't have to give you the entire portrait of Jesus. So I'm not saying you have to believe in the miracles and the exorcisms. But for example, do you think Jesus was ever in Samaria? Do you think at the time Jesus existed, Pontius Pilate was the prefect of Rome? Like, is there anything historically we can know apart from him existing? That's the first question I want to ask.
I would be lying if I said that I had any great knowledge. Uh, far as I know, Pontius Pilate was believed to have been a historical person. Whether Jesus ever visited Samaria or not, I have no idea. But
That's
I don't
fair.
have any reason. I don't have any reason to think that he didn't.
Okay, that's fair.
I'm willing to accept most, you know, of what it records about him in the Gospels. I'm not that interested in anything outside of the Gospels, um,
Okay, that's fair.
primarily because they were later in time,
And they're not written
and
as biographies
well,
either.
it's
So,
sort of like
yeah.
today. I make a claim on Facebook, and it's a remarkable claim. I say that, I saw some celebrity here in a grocery store, and I know that's trivial, but it would be mentioned by somebody else on Facebook, and then it would be on Perez Hilton, and it would be on Twitter, and maybe it would repeat it 100,000 times. And 20 years from now, somebody's reporting that my original fib, on other social media, right? So now it's established truth. Well, no, it's not established truth. The number of reports doesn't increase. It might increase the verisimilitude, but it doesn't increase the actual fact of the matter, the likelihood of the fact of the matter.
No, I get the analogy. The analogy is to multiple attestation. That's one of the criteria of history. So I
Right.
get it. I don't know if it's a very good analogy, but I understand it. And
Mm-hmm.
all I'm asking actually right now, not even those specific examples I gave about Jesus, Samaria and stuff. I'm not asking if you believe those. I'm asking if you think we have any knowledge, not just that he exists, but is there anything that you think we probably have adequate historical information to say that this probably happened? Like if you were to, and you don't need to know what it is, but if you were to Google Alexander the Great You'll find a Wikipedia article or maybe even scholastic peer-reviewed stuff that mentions stuff. You'd probably
Sure.
read it, some of it, and you'd probably be like, okay, you would probably just accept it on the authority of the historians to some degree. I'm saying, do you have anything like that about Jesus? Would you be willing to
Sure.
admit that? Okay, okay, that's all I needed. Now, with
Yeah.
that, what I'm going to tell you here, maybe you won't agree with me, maybe you haven't heard it before, or maybe you have and you just haven't given much thought. You can let me know. I'm going to give you what are considered the historical facts of that caliber, uh, just relevant to the resurrection. Now, there are many others, and these won't include things like the virgin birth, the miracles, the angel at the tomb. It's not going to include those because historical inquiry can't grant the supernatural. So I'm just going to list what are considered the historical facts. I know facts has that connotation. What probably happened, in the
Right.
same way with Alexander the Great and all those others. So obviously Jesus exists, but one of them is the crucifixion. That's considered historical by all the criteria of historicity that we would believe any other thing on. The crucifixion is one of them. The next one is the burial. The next one, although it's a lot more contentious today because I think it's the most tangible one, was the empty tomb. Then was the appearances. Not that the appearances actually happened, but that there were reports of people claiming to have the experience of the appearance. That's a very qualitatively different. I want to make sure they're not saying that Jesus was actually there, because then that just implies the resurrection. It's just saying that people were reporting independently that they had experiences of Jesus appearing to them, and then that the disciples sincerely believed in the resurrection. That's it. The resurrection itself is not one of the facts. The angel of the tomb, whether certain dialogues happen, I'm not including any of those. Now, loosely, that list there. I don't know how much you're trusting me, but loosely, would you adhere to that list in the similar nature of the previous question I asked you, with all the other things we went over?
Whether I believed he was crucified and was buried and that possibly there was an empty tomb?
Yeah, so those three. And then that there were reports of people having experiences that they claimed to have genuinely believed in the experience of them appearing to him. Not that he actually did, but that happened. And then that the disciples and the surrounding people involved actually believed that he was risen from the dead. That's it. Those are the only facts I'm presenting. And those are the only facts that we can historically claim. We can't even claim that there was a stone. We can't claim the names of the women, because there's a certain, and I don't want to get too scholastic in this video, but there are certain criteria of historicity that are used to establish whether we consider that this probably happened and this probably didn't, or the historical nuggets that Craig sometimes uses to get the historical nuggets out of the whole narrative. That criteria is the same we use for all of history, and with that, that's what's considered in the scholarship as more likely historical compared to all the other stuff, relevant to the resurrection at least. So there's other mundane, boring facts about Jesus that are probably considered historical, but they aren't relevant to the resurrection. So I didn't include those.
I'm a pretty skeptical person, and I don't mean just in as it pertains to the resurrection. Have you ever read Stranger in a Strange Land
I
by
don't.
Robert Heinlein?
I don't think so. No.
Well, in Stranger, sorry for the digression, but it relates. In Stranger in a Strange Land, you have, I think they're called faithful witnesses or true witnesses. And so if a faithful witness, maybe it's a true witness, was standing on the opposite side of a barn, surveying its side, and they came around the barn and they were talking to me and you said, so what side is that barn painted? The faithful witness would say, I don't know. You said, what do you mean you don't know? You just saw the side of the barn. And then the faithful witness would say, well, it was painted white when I saw it, but I don't know what color it is now. I am not that degree of skeptic. It's not practical to be that degree of skeptic, but I feel I have no need to take positions on things so that I have absolutely no way of knowing. I'm certainly not. I'm not skeptical of Jesus or someone like him at that time having had those experiences, but I can't say that I know that it happened either. And for me, it's not actually important. What's important is whether the resurrection occurred.
Well, we're not there yet, but we're getting closer. So, I don't know if you have to say knowledge either. Maybe you could say, are they rational to believe? But would you say you take that same approach with all figures of antiquity and events?
Believe it or not, I take that same approach with everything in life. It's
So,
just the way that I'm
would it
wired.
would it make a difference to you if this is what the scholarship said?
No, no, it actually wouldn't,
Okay,
because
that's fair.
the scholars have, you know, can we talk about credentials for a second?
Well, before you
So
do, we can, but right before you pivot to that, if it's doubting certain, if it's related to doubting certain demographics of scholars because of where they're from or what they believe, I mean, there can be some degree of validity of arguing that direction, but it is a similar direction that the youngers keep doing with these biologists, and I have a hard
no, it
time,
has nothing to do with who they are, or what they're
or where their
discussing,
degrees come
etc.
from, or what their degrees are in.
So it's no nothing to do
Okay,
with that. I don't care whether it's, you know, Ken Strobel or,
Lee Strobel, yeah.
you know, um, I mean, something is either true or it's not true,
Mm-hmm.
and that's my only concern. So if I hire a plumber to fix my leaky sink, right? Uh, the plumber of the expertise of the, excuse me, the expertise of the plumber is manifest, and it's important. I'm not going to go in for open heart surgery unless I know that the surgeon has some experience. I'm not going to be his first patient, right? I'm not going to be. But when you're talking about a historian, and I'm talking about all historians, and to be honest, I'm going to include all archaeologists, all cosmologists, all astrophysicists,
Geologists too.
anybody whose discipline involves unknowable things, what we call the operational sciences versus the no, the historical
Historical
sciences
sciences, yeah.
versus the operational scientists. I don't trust their judgment any more than I do my own.
I mean, I get
They're
it.
not magic.
I get that, and that's a slightly I mean, evolution's included in that. That's a slightly dangerous precedent because. So, do you believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old? 4.6 billion years old?
I believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old?
Yeah, the current date today is.
Probably.
I mean, would you say that Jesus was probably buried in a tomb?
If he, assuming his historical existence, yes, he was probably buried in the tomb.
What do you see what I'm doing though? I'm trying to see your degree of adherence to your historical skepticism. So,
So, okay, do I know or do I believe that the Earth is okay? I'll give you the perfect example, and I am being entirely honest here, entirely straightforward here, of the nature or the degree of my skepticism. If tomorrow Neil, what's his name,
Neil
Neil
deGrasse
something
Tyson.
Tyson,
Mhm.
came on to television and with some other distinguished scientist and said, I don't know how to tell you this, folks, but we've discovered the secret for the origin of the universe, or something major, and it says, and it's caramel custard, gravity, everything, in ways that are too complicated for me to explain, are caramel custard. The elasticity and in particular of Carmel. Everything hinges on that. If they had a persuasive argument that was better than all of the existing arguments, that answered somehow, answered more of the questions than any argument before that, I would believe it, right? But that's because every argument to me, and I mean literally every argument, is provisional.
Yes,
I
that's
don't
true.
accept anything, you know, except for the pragmatic things.
Right. Yeah,
Of
we're not
course, I
dealing with
accept the pragmatic
pragmatism.
things.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yeah, because I wouldn't get out of bed if I couldn't accept the pragmatic
So
things.
I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't follow it right, but I'm trying to get a qualitative difference between your You didn't answer them quite the same. You said you probably believe the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, but you didn't say that about Jesus being buried. So there's something. What would you say is the qualitative difference
No,
there?
no, I said I'm sorry if I didn't make that
Oh,
clear. I
okay.
think Jesus probably was buried.
Okay, that's all I needed.
Um,
That's good. That's good.
I don't have any reason. I have no compelling reason to doubt that Jesus was buried.
I agree with you, and that's all we really need. I mean, it's like, did Spartacus was Spartacus ever in Capua in the Roman Empire? Probably. I don't know that's certain. I don't honestly. We probably know that with about the same precision as the age of the Earth. That's geological. That's a historical science. We probably know that the same. That's all. That's all I'm
Can I say one more
offering.
thing?
Yes.
During my lifetime, when I was a little boy in elementary school, plate tectonics about that period was still sort of new science. Uh, it wasn't talked about in the same reverential tones or as a certainty as it is today. And the Big Bang Theory isn't really that old.
No, it's not.
So,
It's really not.
what the things that we know today, scientific knowledge change all the time.
Oh yeah, it's very provisional.
Uh,
Whereas historical
yeah, very
knowledge is less
provisional.
so. I mean, that's true. I don't know if that's actually a point against historical knowledge, but I think it's even more. It's a little irrelevant, but what's even more extraordinary is that we knew about other galaxies empirically before we knew about other planets, exoplanets. We actually weren't
Isn't that
able.
amazing?
We weren't able really to verify exoplanets empirically until like I think it was the 90s or something. And
Yeah, very, very
we could
recently.
see other
The only reason
galaxies.
I threw that in there was because of the question about the Earth being
Well,
4.5
yes,
billion years old.
there is a degree of of qualitative difference with historical science, and historical human history. Yeah, there's a degree of difference, but in terms of its historical nature, they're actually quite similar.
Mm-hmm.
We use very similar processes, and that explanatory list I gave you is used in both. Um, so, but you don't have to commit extra to believe what I'm telling you, because the events of Jesus are better attested than a lot of major figures. You would, in a loose conversation, if someone asked you, unrelated to religion, you'd probably just say probably, just like you did with 4 point. And that's all I'm trying to, I guess I could say, get out of you.
Okay,
I'm trying to see if we're on the same
sure,
line. So those
right.
facts I mentioned, the historical parts relevant to the resurrection, that's all I was offering, is saying that those probably happened given what we can know about ancient history and figures of antiquity. That's all I'm saying. Now, if you take those that list I gave you, I guess you could include Jesus existed in that. I usually that's a given, but he was crucified, he was buried, in a tomb that was publicly known. The tomb was discovered empty. There were reports of experiences that he appeared to people. Those people sincerely believed he was risen. So if you take all that, and then you take the explanatory criteria I gave you, and you say, okay, and you have all that, and then if God exists in your background information, this is where I think.
I think my wife is going to be walking into the house just in a second.
Mhm.
Can you give me 10 seconds?
Sure, yeah, take your time. Saying is, if you take all the things I've been saying and you put them together, that's where I believe the resurrection's a rational belief. I don't want to say, just like with God existing, it won't impose itself on you, it won't compel you, but I think it's very rational. And as we're doing this as a sort of intellectual exercise, which a lot of people do,
Hmm.
if this is actually, if someone's really sincerely seeking truth about it, and especially if it really happened and all this is real, there's obviously a dimension, an element to this that isn't just that. There's some existential relevance or spiritual relevance to it. And that's where, if you're actually going to believe it, if someone actually believes in the resurrection, it can't just stop at pure intellectual exercise. And that step, I think, is usually where people are going to get lost. They're going to lose interest, or they're going to lose sincerity, or whatever it is, because you can lay out its rational foundations as much as I am right now. And when you put it all together, at the end of the day, you've got to make a decision or an inference or something. Did he rise or did he not? Do I believe is it perfectly balanced? Or you're going to have to do some pivot. And clearly, if it's real, if you're really going to believe it, there's a huge existential problem there, or leap, I guess you could say. And I can't do anything for the individual on that. There's really nothing I could say that could allow them to open up to this sort of existential or spiritual leap, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, as far as just the rational parts go, I can get you up to that point. Maybe I can get you that far, whether it's you personally or whoever's watching this. But I
Hmm.
can't take that extra leap for you. There's just nothing I can do as just a guy. There's nothing I can do to do that. So if you take it,
In the Soren Kierkegaard sense.
yeah, and, well, I actually agree with Kierkegaard as a Christian. So in my Christian beliefs, so after logically posterior to everything we're talking about, Kierkegaard argues similarly to Plantinga, where he's saying that not everyone's going to have this information that we're saying here. And I'm not saying that this is the only legitimate means to reasonably believe it, because if it's real and the Holy Spirit's real, then someone can have, like, obviously that can be real for them. But I'm obviously not offering that to you. So all I'm saying is, for the rational side, if you take everything I just gave you, if all this, it's important to keep it all together at the same time. If you actually examine it as a historical explanation, and it's possible that some supernatural event occurred, and you think about, okay, how well does it explain those facts? If Jesus was actually risen, which means he was dead, so that explains one fact. It means that if he was buried and that tomb was empty, it would make sense that if he was risen, he would no longer be in the tomb. It would make sense that he appeared to people. So, do you think that? I mean, I would like to think that's obvious, but then its scope. How good is the scope? Does it explain all of those facts by itself? I think it pretty clearly does. How plausible is it given in which it took place? That's the plausibility one. And you brought up an objection way earlier about other people being claimed to have been risen, all these things. I think it's plausible given Jesus himself. It wasn't some. And if you watch my other video, I make an analogy. If some guy crawls out of the grave in front of my eyes, I'm going to believe it happened, but I'm not going to start thinking he's the Son of God or the Messiah. I'm probably just going to think he's a zombie. But it's the fact that it was this specific person at this specific time. Like, it'd be too coincidental to say, okay, he really rose from the dead, but everything else is not true. I think that's less sincere. So that's why I believe those things. And then, how ad hoc is it? So ad hoc is, I think, a potential good objection, because it does imply supernatural things. And you can measure how ad hoc something is by how many different theories do you have to believe to allow you to rationally believe in this. And I think you could get very specific, but if you're being honest, I think really the only additional belief is theism. I think that's really the only additional background thing you have to adopt in addition to everything else most people share. Now you can come up with alternate explanations that are plausible, like hallucination theory, he wasn't really dead, the body was stolen. There's all sorts of different explanations. But if you're being rational about it, if you're being sincere, you have to ask, is it better on all those criteria than the resurrection? And that's given that if God exists. Does it explain all the facts? Does it explain the facts at the same degree? Are there additional ad hoc things you have to adopt? How plausible are they really? If you really examine all those things, I believe that, just rationally speaking, the resurrection is the superior explanation just on those criteria. With no previous prejudice saying that I don't want it to be true or I want it to be true. If you're just trying to be rational. And that's the simple offering that I'm giving. Now, if you want to ask me a question, raise an objection, you can definitely do it. But I hope that at least made sense because I was rambling a little bit there. So as long as that at least
No,
made
it
sense,
made sense.
okay.
It made sense. Um, I have, as I've said before, I have no objections to the existence of the supernatural. I mean, and that doesn't even matter to me how you define supernatural. I have atheist
Yeah, we don't have to get
friends
into that. Yeah.
who really, uh, for them, they don't distinguish between the supernatural and the natural at all. The supernatural is just the natural that we don't understand yet, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe they're right, but I don't
I
favor
mean, it's a
that
cute statement.
definition.
Yeah, I agree with you, and
It's a
that's
cute
similar.
statement.
Yeah, I don't think anything really hinges on it because for a person like that, I don't want to accuse them in their face that they're incredulous, but it's kind of hinting at it. It's like the spaceless thing we talked about at the beginning. It's like if you really try
Right.
to talk with precision about it, if that's what you want, if that's the hill you want to die on, then sure, go for it. I'm not really going to go out of my way to
So
try to get them to understand that.
so I'm fine uh, with the idea that the supernatural exists in this universe, whether I understand it or not, whether I always identify it or not. Because there could be supernatural things occurring around me at this moment that I don't recognize. See
Mm-hmm.
the angel back here? Either do I. But, doesn't mean that there's not one there. Okay, that was a bad example.
I get the
But
point.
I
Yeah.
all I'm trying to convey is I don't deny the possibility of the supernatural.
Yeah, and that's only the first step,
Uh,
really. I mean, I would maybe push it a little more and say specifically theism, given the specific thing we're talking about, which is God raising Jesus from the dead. But I would say it's
sure,
necessary. Like, so for example, if you believe in a full fledged classical theism, your openness to the resurrection will be a little higher than if you just believe in the supernatural. But then that would be higher than if you were a naturalist, right? So there's like a tier, I guess.
sure.
And I mean, that's up to the individual to hash out on their own. But when it comes to all of this that I just went over, I think if someone's really reflecting seriously on it, one of a handful of things have to happen for them still to not believe. They're either going to end up denying, they're going to backtrack and deny one of those historical facts I mentioned. They're either going to end up denying that supernatural is possible, or they're going to just really hinge on some other explanation, or just raise their skeptic meter high enough to just not have to deal with the existential problem that it implies. Usually it goes in one of those
I
directions.
I can explain, you know, uh, fairly well why I don't believe that it was likely that the resurrection occurred.
Well,
And I have to
I
add
agree
the
with you.
words why that it was not likely that the resurrection occurred because I'm not saying that it didn't occur,
Yep.
right?
I guess
Uh,
can I represent you properly? You can tell me if this is right because in order to respond to
sure.
it, I like to accurately represent. You would say that it's not that you're saying it didn't happen, but that the information we have wouldn't be sufficient to say it likely happened. Is that a better way of
Correct.
okay? I agree with you. I think that's a
That's
rational belief. Now, what I
that's what I'm saying. That's
yes,
what I'm saying.
and that makes sense.
And and let's take Julius Caesar. No matter what else I believe or that you believe about Jews, the historicity of Julius Caesar, if you read or was in a history book that Julius Caesar had flown on the back of a unicorn, as apparently Mohammed did, um, would you believe it?
No, of course not.
No, you wouldn't.
Right.
And you probably wouldn't believe it if you read that he died and been resurrected either.
Probably not.
Um,
I'll admit.
and so I I look at it like this. I described earlier that I was raised in a Pentecostal environment, that I spent many, many, many hours at faith healing meetings. And I know that lots of people believe that miracles occur based on extremely bad evidence that they believed when it was obvious to anybody paying any attention that there wasn't a miracle that occurred, right? Um,
Yes.
you know, and I'm not angry at those people. I don't even think that they're stupid people, but they're people who have a lot of faith, and it's something that they believe because of the accumulation of all of their life experiences. Um, I know extremely intelligent people who sat in those auditoriums
Mm-hmm.
watching the fake faith healing, who believed everything that they watched. It's nothing that I understand. I don't understand the cognitive dissonance there, but I accept that they did.
Wait.
Um,
Okay. Um,
so let's pretend that there's what city do you live in?
it's
What's the
called
city you told me? I forget. It's in Arkansas.
Yeah, Fayetteville.
What?
Fayetteville.
Fayetteville. So
Yeah.
you're in Fayetteville, and let's pretend that you have a celebrity, maybe that's a major celebrity in Fayetteville, but hasn't really made much of an impact everywhere else yet. They're a regional singer. They sing at all of the folk festivals and whatnot. People outside of Fayetteville don't necessarily know who they are, or within about 100-mile radius. And there are still singers like that have a big local following, but they're not played on the radio when they don't have Facebook or Instagram. They're not on Twitter, etc. But anyway, um, you hear one day that they died, and you think, oh, that's sad. I really liked them, right? I'm not trying to trivialize this. I'm just struggling for the example here. This is impromptu.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hear that they've died, and then a couple of days later, you're on Twitter? Let's say 3 days later, you're on Twitter, and there are hundreds of people who say, oh my God, I saw, let's just name this star Bianca. I saw Bianca, you know, in the park. And there's lots of people who also say, maybe thousands of people who also say that they saw Bianca in the park. Um, and then then they disappear. Maybe people say that they saw Bianca ascend into heaven. Would you believe it?
So, if I understand the question, it's this because you said a lot of different things there. So to answer your direct question, I don't. If that's all I have, if I don't have any other information, I guess I would say you said hundreds of people say they saw Beyonce. Is that what you said? I don't know. I probably would. I guess I don't know. But you mentioned Caesar rising from the dead or riding on a unicorn, and people saying that hundreds of people saying they saw someone. Now maybe I didn't represent that correctly because you said a lot there. I'm trying to remember it all, so it's hard for me to sometimes respond to larger paragraphs. But if I misrepresent something, correct me.
Sure.
That if there were claims on like Facebook and stuff, and hundreds of people said they saw Beyonce, would I believe them?
Uh, I didn't use the name Beyonce. I said Bianca.
Oh,
I didn't want
Bianca.
to.
Okay, I thought you said Beyonce for some
Yeah.
reason.
So,
So
it
some
could be
celebrity.
Beyonce,
Okay.
but it's
So
just I wanted to be a celebrity that wasn't globally known.
okay, yeah. So
Because Jesus wasn't.
let's say it's the CEO of um, Walmart. Would I believe that? Yes, because it's very plausible given where I live. He lives in Bentonville. But if it was
Okay.
Beyonce, just in the vacuum, I would still say yes, because why make that up? Why, if it's hundreds of people that on
Okay.
my Facebook, but there could be more. You could add more background information that would make it less plausible. So it does depend on the background information a little bit.
Okay.
And
Now, mm,
like why?
but
Here's why I
you're
would believe it.
looking at Twitter, you're looking at Facebook,
Hmm.
Instagram, TikTok, all the different, and I'm on all of those. And one thing that is conspicuous is the absence of any pictures,
Okay,
right?
so I followed the analogy up to the picture part. So what's the analogy? So there's no pictures. That would be a little suspicious today. So what would that be
Today,
in antiquity? What's
today would be a
missing?
little suspicious. And it's not, I'm not arguing that it didn't happen. I'm saying that today, if there weren't the photographs and the accompanying videos, because everybody has a smartphone, um, you would be unlikely to believe it. Or put it this way, I wouldn't believe it. Maybe you would. I don't
I
know.
probably
But the
wouldn't.
first thing that I would think to myself is, and I know you talked about this as something as an answer uh, that you didn't necessarily agree with or like. I would say, well, who declared? Who was the coroner? Who was the? There's been lots of people. I mean, you can open up the several times in the last year. There have been people who've died, especially in like India, who've ended up on a slab in a mortician and woke up and walked away. Right? Well, they weren't dead. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying Jesus wasn't dead. That's not the argument I'm saying.
I know, I know.
I'm talking about not why the people then believed it. I'm not asking why the people then believed it. The people then might have seen a resurrected Jesus, right?
Yeah,
It's
um,
I
yeah.
mean, because I accept the
Oh, of course, of
possibility of a
course.
resurrection,
And I'm not
they
claiming
might have seen a resurrected Jesus.
yes, and that's the
I'm saying that based on
oh,
the
sorry.
evidence, if you're using the same standard of evidence, you believe that Jesus resurrected based on not a whole lot of documentation,
Well,
not a whole
I
lot of documentation that is not. I mean,
I get
I'm
it.
sure
Yeah.
you know what the Q document is.
Yep.
I don't know that I even accept the Q document
Well,
theory.
it's not a document. It's a source. Not that's not necessarily a
Sure, right?
document,
Okay,
but
the Q sourse.
yeah, that's
Sorry,
not nothing hinges on that. But your
nothing.
point's
What I'm
correct.
saying is there was actually not that much written, uh, and it was all written by people. None of it was exactly contemporaneous.
Well,
I
no,
mean,
it
it
wasn't.
wasn't written hundreds of years
Like
later.
nothing
It
was
was
written by
probably written within
Jesus
the
or interview. You're right. You're right. And I'm
right.
not
There was no
claiming.
interviews, so you have a couple of people who wrote that that 500 people had witnessed his resurrection, or excuse me, him in his resurrected form. Um,
Now, can I need
that's
to
not
before I miss the point because we're going. Yeah, I still got to go back to your Caesar analogy too, so don't let me forget that. But
sure. Yeah, sorry.
you're absolutely right. I'm not claiming. Let's say Jesus rose from the dead, and some people actually physically saw him or even touched him. They have much higher epistemic warrant to believe that than I would. You're right, and that's actually an objection that Kierkegaard addresses. Now, I don't have to get too much in details of that because I'm conceding that. I'm not claiming that what I'm offering here is on the same pedestal as that. And I don't think it needs to be rational. But obviously, if someone who saw Jesus, like Thomas, who didn't believe it, according to the story, and he saw it, and then he believed. Obviously, that's way different than believing some historical account 2 millennia later. I mean, those are clearly of different quality. But it depends on where that objection's trying to go, because that's true. But if you're, are you trying to object with the analogies to, seeing the celebrity? Is there a certain fact of the list I gave you that you want to raise more skepticism on? Because we can go back and examine those again. But that's
I
up to
mean,
you. Because it seems like
let me
that's what
say
that's
that
addressing.
if you told me, and I talked to you for the first time online just a few days ago, right?
Hmm.
If you told me that that you'd seen somebody resurrected, and I don't mean you'd seen somebody after the fact, but maybe you'd witnessed the resurrection,
Hmm.
and you knew for a fact they were dead, either because you were a doctor or because they'd actually been cut in half or something, right? Where the fact of their death was not open to discussion.
Hmm.
They were dead,
Maybe you
right?
saw them dead. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Maybe I saw them dead,
Hmm.
but if you told me that you had, I would believe you. I would believe you. And and to be honest, it would be sort of stupid for me to do so because I don't really know you,
Hmm.
right? You could be somebody from an asylum. I don't have any. Not. I don't think you are. Just to clarify, right?
You'd be more
But
likely
I
to believe
would.
me too if some other person unrelated to me told you that. Now,
Exactly.
I'm not
Exactly.
claiming, let's be careful, I'm not claiming the resurrection. I'm not offering that in the same way that if I were to claim that. I'm not saying you should believe those in the same way, or at least rationally speaking. I want to make sure that's clear because I'm admitting that when I say it's rational to believe Jesus rose from the dead, I'm not saying it's like that same quality as someone who saw it. I'm admitting it, right? I don't
So,
want to.
and
Nothing
thank you.
hinges on that.
I appreciate that degree of candidness.
Yes,
You
but
know, but basically,
yeah.
I'll be done in two
Oh,
seconds.
good. Go ahead.
Basically, for me, it all hinges on if I'm using exactly the same standards of evidence for something that was alleged to have occurred 2,000 years ago that I would apply today. And that is the standard of evidence that I used. And I'm going to say no in exactly the same way that I wouldn't believe that Shakespeare was resurrected if somebody had claimed that about him.
Okay, I can deal
If
with that
some
claim. Yeah, yeah. That's a different type of objection, but it's a good one. It's a very good one, and I think it's something that Christians need to sincerely address better. I think. But yes, no, you're right. And now I'll add. I admitted that those were different quality, but I'll add it doesn't need to be at that quality to be rational to believe. And some people will use this passage that Jesus said as a sort of irrational thing, but that I think is what Jesus meant when he said, "You believe because you have seen, but blessed are those who have not seen and believed." I think that's what he's
Mhm.
saying is because if you can believe this on other grounds, like the commission to the disciples to make this record, that's in the Christian context of faith, which is being able to be open to something like that and not just being completely closed-minded. I think that's what Jesus was saying. That's another point though. But I do think you're right, but it doesn't need to be that level to be rational. And I try to drive that home in most of my videos because we bring it up at the beginning, but it gets lost a lot of the time. So whoever's watching this, you won't have the same quality of evidence that the disciples had or that this hypothetical person had, but you don't need that to be rational. That doesn't mean you have to believe it. It's not going to compel itself on you. But if you are open to theism and you're open to these things, and then the existential problem will still be there, that's usually what it will come down to. And the multiple examples of other people rising from the dead, it I don't the reason I actually don't think this is I think it's a good objection, but I don't think it sustains itself as a good example against the claim of Jesus rising from the dead. This is usually referred to as the religio-historical context. It's not just some random person, and it's not just because it's risen from the dead. It could have been anything, hypothetically. It's like if there's a claim that Julius Caesar could shoot fire out of his hands, that's probably almost as extraordinary as a resurrection.
Right.
But it's not because it's a resurrection. If anything, it's because it's kind of extraordinary, right? But
Right.
the fact that it's the resurrection and it's specifically Jesus in the context of who he was claiming to be and what he was supposed to be doing, that's a little bit more of a clue, given everything else I said. That's more likely than some random person rising from the dead. And a better analogy would be if there was a huge lightning bolt that we both saw. That's not that extraordinary. And some person that was closer, that we knew lived closer and he was there at the time, claimed, I saw Poseidon appear from
Right.
the lightning bolt. It's obviously we wouldn't believe him. But if the same scenario, but he said I saw Thor appear from the lightning bolt, we still probably wouldn't believe him. But that's a little more likely.
A
Not by
little bit more
much.
likely,
It's
for
a
whatever
little bit
reason,
more
yeah.
likely. Now you take enough of those little more likely steps and whatever the explanation is, and eventually you're going to have at least something that's qualitatively different enough to be more plausible. That's the analogy to Jesus rising as opposed to anything else you said. Because
I agree with you absolutely as far as it's not irrational to believe. Uh, and I'm going to be truthful. If I could believe, I would. If there was a switch on the back of my head, a toggle switch that was had a believe in one direction and disbelieve in the other, I'd flip it up. My life would not only be more interesting, but I'd probably have a larger group of friends, right?
that's really
and
good you
and
said
I,
that.
I would certainly suffer in no way. But
Yes. Now
and this is a controversial thing, but belief's not actually a choice. If it
I
was,
agree.
I could believe that I was 16 foot tall, right? I can't.
I agree with that.
Um,
Belief is not a choice. I think there's
oh,
something
thank you.
else.
So many
It's
people
true.
don't get that.
Now, Christians listening to this, faith doesn't have to be considered a choice. There can still be room for the will and the responsibility of the will that can eventually lead to the relevance of the choice, but the choice itself of being persuaded is not something that I think is located in the will. So I'm agreeing with you. And this might be a good segue to the end because it is going a little long, and I would love to continue further conversations with you in the future. By the way, I would like to bring you back on. But
No problem.
with what you just said there, that it's rational, and you wish anyone listening or watching that's in the same position that he's in, but you still don't believe. I think the only thing left is the existential part that could be. I don't want to say it's getting in their way, but that's the only thing that's really left. I believe existential or spiritual component to this because if it's real, if he really rose from the dead and the canon of Christianity is true to whatever degree that the real one's true, not because there's a lot of different flavors. There's obviously more to it than its mere intellectual exercise. There is some existential component to what Jesus was claiming and what the apostles were claiming and what the early church was believing and doing and what the Christians claim to experience. If any of that's actually real, then if you just stop at, sure, it's rational to believe, you can stop there. I mean, it doesn't have to go farther for you. But believing it, actually believing it's real, which means you're saying, I'm convinced it's true and it really happened, that implies an existential concession that just the rational evidence and components alone won't get you. And I can't do anything about that. I guess the closest
No,
thing you could do is maybe get away from Christianity and the resurrection stuff and start examining just kind of the relevance of theism and listen to debates on does theism imply a certain existential things or don't it? Read Nietzsche, read other counterpoint, read those things, examine that, go on the existential journey because as soon as you hit okay, it's rational to believe but I still don't believe, I think it's only the existential problem from there, at least as far as
no,
I can
you're
tell.
right. I would never have publicly announced my atheism, right? I could have lived quite happily. I still go to church, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not every Sunday because of the COVID-19, but I was a regular churchgoer up until, and not as a Christian. I enjoyed the hymns, the socialization, etc. If it wasn't for some of the accretions, right, of the last 2,000 years that I find sort of morally repugnant in a lot of cases, I might have been able to you know, and maybe I would have returned to belief because if you practice something long enough, it sticks.
Hmm. That's true.
Um, so in particular, the whole obsession over, and this is for Roman Catholics only, but the perpetual virginity of Mary.
Hmm.
What?
Yeah, there are
Why
some.
are you obsessing
There are
about whether
definitely those.
Mary's mother ever had sex or not? That's a problem.
Well, I like that you brought that up because that there's other things of, and I like talking about the Christian specifics because we got to that point. I think it would be good to end there. Because I think
Sure.
we agreed on that last point. I would love to have you on again and maybe talk about those things because you might like the flavor of
Absolutely.
Christian I am. 'Cause I actually haven't revealed a whole lot about my Christian specific beliefs, so you might like it better, and not like it better like you're gonna believe it, but you just might think it's more interesting. But yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.